Earth had always been quiet, tucked away on the edge of the galaxy. It had never known the true weight of the conflicts that raged between the stars. Humans lived their lives in peaceful oblivion, unaware of the threats lurking just beyond the vast reaches of space. They built their cities, explored their world, and looked out at the stars as if they were safe from the chaos that roiled across the galaxy. The sky above them was a serene canvas, untouched by the wars that others fought. But then something changed in the farthest reaches of space, something no one on Earth could explain. An energy signature appeared on the sensors of the galactic observatories, a strange pulse that had never been detected before. The signal was weak, at first a simple fluctuation barely worth noting. But as the days passed, the fluctuations grew stronger and more erratic. It wasn't long before humans realized it was not a natural phenomenon. It was something else, something artificial. The reports came in from all corners of the galaxy of strange events that were too disturbing to ignore. Entire fleets of ships vanished without a trace. Colonies were wiped out without a single distress signal or warning. It was as if they had never existed at all, a silence so complete that even the stars seemed to hold their breath. In Earth's capital, a high-ranking council of scientists, diplomats, and military officials gathered to discuss the growing mystery. The information coming in was fragmented and contradictory, but the pattern was undeniable. Something was out there, something dangerous. The only clue was the sudden and unexplained silence spreading across the stars. As the debate raged in the council room, a single transmission arrived. It was encrypted and carried the unmistakable signature of a long-lost colony. The signal was garbled and faint, but there was a sense of urgency in the broken words. They could barely make out the frantic tone of the message, as if the speaker were racing against time. There was no clear message, no warning, just one phrase that repeated over and over: "The silence has come." The transmission ended abruptly, and no one could explain what had happened to the colony that sent it or why the message was so unsettling. It was a cold chill that ran down the spine of every listener. The silence had indeed come, and with it something far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The news spread across Earth like wildfire. People tried to remain calm, but an undercurrent of fear began to seep into every conversation. The government moved quickly to assess the situation, but even they were unsure how to respond to something so vast and unknown. It wasn't until the next few days that the full scale of the threat began to reveal itself. A fleet of unknown ships appeared on the edges of the galaxy, their design unlike anything humanity had ever seen. They were massive, silent, and seemingly invincible. No communications were received, no demands made, just the unmistakable presence of ships that dwarfed anything the galaxy had ever encountered. As they drew closer to the center of the galaxy, the silence grew deeper. No one could understand why these ships were here or what they wanted, but one thing was clear: their arrival was not an accident. They were coming, and the galaxy was trembling with the fear of what would happen next. The days following the arrival of the mysterious fleet were tense and full of uncertainty. The Galactic Council convened urgently, sending messages to every corner of the galaxy to seek advice and draw up a plan, but the messages came back in silence. Entire fleets tasked with investigating the foreign ships vanished without a trace. Communications were cut off abruptly, and nothing could be heard except the eerie hum of static. The silence was everywhere. No one knew what was happening, or why fleets of warships simply disappeared without warning. It wasn't an attack, at least not in any way the galaxy had ever seen before. There were no explosions, no signs of battle, just empty space. Where once entire fleets had been, no one had even seen the enemy ships engage in combat. The silence seemed to be their weapon. They didn't need to fire a shot to erase a fleet from existence. It didn't take long for the whispers to spread across the galaxy. The name York began to surface again, ancient tales of a race so powerful, so silent that entire civilizations had fallen before them, not by force, but by their absolute ability to eliminate any resistance. With eerie quiet efficiency, the York had been spoken of in hushed tones for centuries, a ghost story of the stars, an enemy so terrifying that even the mightiest of empires had not dared to test their strength. As the York fleet advanced toward the galactic core, it became clear that the rumors were true. Their ships were silent as death, moving through space with terrifying speed, leaving nothing but emptiness in their wake. Entire colonies disappeared in an instant. No distress calls, no warning, no escape. The galaxy was paralyzed with fear. Those who had once been confident in their technological advancements now trembled at the thought of facing the York. Their fleets were no match for an enemy that didn't need to fire a single weapon to destroy them. They knew nothing about the York. Their tactics were a mystery, their technology beyond comprehension. The silence they left in their wake was not just an absence of sound, it was the absence of hope. The galaxy had never faced such a force. On Earth, the military began to take precautions. The government mobilized its forces and ordered an investigation into the disappearance of the nearby colonies. But for the first time, humanity felt the weight of their isolation. The galaxy was in turmoil, and Earth was caught in the middle with no real understanding of what was happening. A small group of scientists and military leaders met in secrecy to discuss a response to the crisis. They could no longer rely on the galaxy's fractured council to protect them. Humanity had to act for itself. Their first step was simple. They would send out a ship, a single vessel, into the unknown to investigate the source of the threat, to understand who or what the York truly were. The captain of the vessel was a seasoned veteran, a man who had seen conflict before, but never anything like this. He had faced war in the Outer Rim and lived to tell the tale, but the thought of facing the York was something he had never prepared for. Still, he accepted the mission. His orders were clear. He was to find answers, and if possible to survive, to return to Earth with whatever knowledge he could gather about the York and their intentions. The journey into the unknown began with an unsettling quiet. The crew of the ship were on edge, unsure of what to expect, but determined to fulfill their mission. They moved forward with one singular goal: to pierce the silence and discover what lay beyond it. And yet, the deeper they traveled into the galaxy, the more the silence seemed to press in around them. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the absence of everything, an oppressive void that seemed to devour the stars themselves. It felt as if the very universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for something that was still to come. The journey into the unknown grew more unsettling with each passing day. The human ship, the Aegis, ventured deeper into the galaxy, its sensors scanning the empty stretches of space. Ahead, no sign of the York fleet yet, but the silence was undeniable. It was everywhere, and it was suffocating. The crew tried to maintain their composure, but the feeling of being watched never left them. Every member of the crew constantly checked their instruments, eyes scanning the dark void outside, as if expecting to see the massive York ships looming just beyond the next asteroid or nebula. Days turned into weeks, and still there was nothing, not a single sign of the York. But the silence that clung to the stars seemed to be growing stronger. It was in the air, it was in their communications, and it was in the very space around them. It was as if the galaxy itself had become a vast graveyard with no bodies to mourn. The crew of the Aegis had been trained for deep space exploration, but this felt different. This felt like something that was not just happening to them, but to the entire galaxy, as if all life was slowly being erased from existence, one system at a time. The captain of the ship, Captain Elias Graves, a man who had seen the horrors of war and conflict in his time as a commander on Earth's front lines, found himself struggling to keep his crew from breaking under the weight of their mission. On the bridge, Elias stared at the empty space ahead, his mind racing with possibilities. Every piece of data sent back from the sensors was carefully analyzed, but it only led to more questions and fewer answers. They had no idea where the York were or how they operated. The reports of their silent attacks were inconsistent. No one had seen them engage directly in combat, and the few survivors from the destroyed colonies had nothing but terrifying stories of sudden and total disappearance. It wasn't until one fateful day that their long search bore fruit. As the Aegis passed a seemingly abandoned asteroid field, they detected a faint energy signature emanating from an old derelict ship drifting aimlessly within the field. It was an alien vessel that had been clearly damaged long ago, but it was still intact. It wasn't a York ship, but it had clearly been abandoned for a long time. The crew decided to board the derelict and investigate in the hope of finding some clues that would lead them to answers about what had happened to the missing fleets and colonies. As they boarded the derelict ship, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The air smelled stale, and the lights flickered ominously. The ship was eerily quiet, no life signs, no crew, no movement at all, just the haunting silence of an abandoned vessel floating through space. The Aegis team split into small groups to explore the ship and try to decipher what had happened to it. But as they ventured deeper into the vessel, a strange sense of unease began to settle over them. One by one, the crew began to report strange occurrences, strange noises, distant whispers that didn't seem to come from any source, and flickers of movement in the corner of their eyes. Suddenly, one of the engineers screamed over the comms, his voice full of fear. He had found something unexpected, something he couldn't fully explain. On the ship's central data core was an encrypted transmission, a message sent from the Orcs themselves. The message was simple but chilling. It read, "We are the silence, and you will be consumed by it." Before the crew could fully process the implications of the message, the lights on the derelict ship flickered one last time, and the ship's systems went completely dark. The Aegis team raced back to their ship, but they could feel it then, a presence behind them, watching them in the dark. As the silence continued to press in, they understood now the Orcs were not just invaders, they were hunters, and Earth was their next prey. As the Aegis made its way back to Earth's space, the crew knew they had only scratched the surface of the terrifying truth. Their journey had just begun, but now they understood something even more horrifying. The silence wasn't just a weapon, it was a force, an unstoppable force that could not be outrun and could not be resisted. The Orcs had come, and they would stop at nothing to silence the entire galaxy. The Aegis returned to Earth's outer orbit, battered and shaken, carrying more than just their physical scars. The message they had intercepted from the Orcs still echoed in their minds. "We are the silence, and you will be consumed by it." Captain Elias Graves stared out the viewports as Earth's blue and green landscape came into focus, but it was hard to feel a sense of relief. The silence wasn't just a weapon. It was something far worse. It was a force, an unyielding presence that had begun to unravel the galaxy itself. The crew of the Aegis was immediately debriefed, and every word they spoke sent ripples through Earth's command center. The encrypted message was analyzed and decoded further by Earth's top linguists and cryptographers, revealing nothing new, just chilling confirmation. The Orcs were ancient and mysterious, and the message was only the beginning of their campaign to erase entire civilizations. Graves sat in the war room with Earth's highest-ranking officials. The discussion was tense, almost unbearable. No one wanted to accept the possibility that the Orcs were unstoppable. Yet, despite the overwhelming evidence, there was a part of every officer in the room that refused to give in to fear. "They're too quiet," said General Harper, the chief strategist. "We've never faced anything like them. They don't need to engage us. They just make us disappear." "Exactly," Graves said, his voice steady, though he could feel the weight of the situation crushing him. "And that's why we have to understand their tactics. We need to find a way to stop the silence before it spreads any further." The meeting turned into a plan of action. The first step was to discover how the Orcs managed to disable entire fleets without firing a single shot. The Aegis had already uncovered the beginning of an answer. The Orcs used a form of gravitational manipulation, distorting space around their targets. But that was just theory. No one knew exactly how they did it or why. Earth's best engineers, astrophysicists, and military commanders worked round the clock to piece together the puzzle. Days turned into weeks as they analyzed every fragment of data from the derelict ship, the Orc transmissions, and the crew's first-hand accounts of their encounters. One theory, however, kept returning again and again. The Orc had somehow perfected a way to interfere with the very fabric of space-time, essentially erasing the presence of entire fleets without leaving any trace. But what was more disturbing was the psychological effect of the Orcs' weapon. The silence was not just an absence of sound, it was an absence of existence. Ships didn't just vanish, they were wiped from memory. Survivors were left with nothing but the faintest memory of their comrades, a hollow echo of what had been, a cold and terrifying void where once there had been life. In a small meeting room, Graves stood alongside Dr. Ilara Voss, a renowned quantum physicist. She had spent hours studying the data, trying to make sense of what the York were truly doing. "They're not just erasing matter," Dr. Voss said quietly, her eyes narrowed with focus. "They're erasing perception. They aren't just destroying ships. They're wiping them from the minds of everyone in the galaxy. The victims don't remember they ever existed, and neither do their families. It's as if they never were." The implications of this were staggering. Earth was now facing not only a physical war, but a war against memory itself. What could they fight with when the very idea of existence could be erased from the collective consciousness? "We have to fight back," Graves said, his voice firm. "We can't let them take this galaxy from us. We can't let them erase Earth." Dr. Voss nodded, her expression grim but resolute. "We need to find a way to disrupt their manipulation of space-time. If we can break their hold on reality itself, we might stand a chance." It was a long shot, but humanity had no other choice. Earth's military was prepared to launch an offensive, not just to defend their home, but to strike at the heart of the Orc silence. Every available fleet would be mobilized, and the galaxy would either fall under the shadow of the silence, or it would rise to meet it. As the council left the war room, Graves stayed behind, staring out at the endless expanse of stars. The galaxy was already shaking with terror, but one thing was certain. Humanity would not let the silence consume them. They would fight for every last breath, every last memory, until the galaxy was theirs again. The universe was on the brink of collapse, but Earth had found something within itself that would not break. The York may have tried to erase them, to erase everything, but humanity refused to be forgotten. The response was swift. A united coalition of every species willing to stand with Earth in the fight against the silence. The Vexari, the Shaler, and the Harnack, races once thought to be divided by their own differences, now stood together with humans, sharing a common enemy that threatened all life in the galaxy. It wasn't just military forces that rallied. Scientists, engineers, and strategists from every corner of the galaxy worked tirelessly in Earth's hidden research facilities. The first real breakthrough came from the Harnack, whose expertise in advanced quantum mechanics and shielding technologies led to the development of a new kind of force field, one capable of distorting the manipulation of spacetime itself. This was humanity's best hope of breaking through the Orc silence. A new fleet was assembled, smaller than the Orcs, but with a mix of advanced alien tech, human innovation, and raw willpower. The goal was clear: strike directly at the heart of the Orcs' operations before they could erase another system from existence. A first wave of reconnaissance ships would make their way deep into York space, deploying the new quantum shields in hopes of evading the gravitational manipulation that had made the York so deadly. But as Earth's newly formed coalition prepared to launch the offensive, there were cracks in the alliance. The Shaler, known for their psychic abilities, had always been reluctant to get involved in direct combat, preferring instead to stay neutral, observing from the shadows. The Vexari, warriors at their core, were eager to strike, but their brash and aggressive nature clashed with the more measured approach of the Harnack. The coalition was struggling to keep its fragile unity intact. On the bridge of the Aegis, Graves stood alongside his crew, staring at the assembly of ships that had been put together in the last few weeks. This fleet, this diverse mix of races and abilities, was their last hope. "We can't afford to let this fall apart," Graves said quietly to his second-in-command, Lieutenant Avarius. "We may not have a second chance." "We won't let it fall apart," she replied, determination in her eyes. "We fight for what's right. They need us. We need each other." As the fleet set course for the heart of York space, the tension was palpable. No one knew exactly what awaited them, but the silence they had all experienced was at the back of their minds, like a cold hand on their shoulders. Every crew member carried the weight of what had been lost. The lives, the memories, entire civilizations now erased from existence. But they carried the hope that maybe, just maybe, they could be the ones to stop the York. The first leg of the journey was uneventful. The quantum shields worked as expected, protecting their ships from the gravity warping pulses that the York deployed to erase entire fleets. But as they moved closer to the York's central system, the calm before the storm was unsettling. The silence was deafening, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Then the first sign of danger appeared, a distortion in space ahead of them. It was subtle at first, a ripple across the stars that grew larger with every second. The York had sensed their presence, and with that, the galaxy held its breath once more. Graves' voice crackled over the comms to the fleet. "Stay alert. We're about to make history. We are humanity's last chance. Let's make sure the silence doesn't win." The ships moved forward, ready to face whatever the York had in store. There was no turning back now. The first battle of the Galactic War had begun. The fleet of Earth's coalition moved forward into the heart of York space with caution, the silence surrounding them growing heavier with each passing moment. The quiet was unsettling, a stillness that pressed in from all sides, amplifying the weight of their mission. Captain Graves could feel the tension in his bones. It was as though the entire galaxy was holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for them to make the first move, to break the silence that had already claimed so much. As the fleet approached the York's central system, the quantum shields hummed softly, a comforting sound in a galaxy so eerily devoid of noise. It was their only defense against the York's manipulation of space-time, a weapon more terrifying than anything humanity had faced before. The shields were designed to bend the fabric of reality itself, to allow the ships to pass through the gravitational distortions without being wiped from existence. But even with this new technology, Captain Graves knew they were walking a razor-thin line. One misstep, one moment of hesitation, and everything could be lost. "Captain, we're picking up a signal," Lieutenant Reyes said, her voice tight. She worked furiously at her console, eyes scanning the screen for any new information. "It's faint, but it's there." Graves turned toward her, his heart skipping a beat. "Where is it coming from?" "From a nearby planet, just beyond the edge of the system," she replied, her voice full of uncertainty. "It's not the York, but it's not any of our allies either. It could be another survivor, or—" Before she could finish, the ship's sensors flared to life, an alarm blaring across the bridge. Graves gripped the armrest of his chair, his instincts kicking into high gear. The screen flashed with data. An incoming fleet, hundreds of ships, black and formless, emerging from the shadows of the system like ghosts in the dark. "The York," Graves muttered under his breath. There was no mistaking their design. Sleek, massive, and utterly silent. The darkness they radiated seemed to distort the space around them, a wave of cold that sent chills through the crew. "They've been waiting for us," Reyes said, her voice a mixture of dread and determination. "They know we're here." The bridge fell silent as the full scale of the threat became apparent. The York didn't just have numbers, they had control. Control over gravity, over space itself. They could destroy entire fleets without ever firing a shot, without even making a sound. And now, they were closing in. "Prepare for battle," Graves ordered, his voice steady despite the tension gripping him. "Activate all quantum shields. Let's see if our defense can hold." The crew moved swiftly, their training kicking in. The coalition's ships aligned in a defensive formation, their shields flickering to life as they braced for the incoming onslaught. The York fleet didn't make a sound. They didn't need to. As the first wave of York ships came into range, the Aegis and the other ships launched their counterattacks. Energy blasts shot out from the fleet, barely making a dent against the impenetrable darkness of the York vessels. Then, as if by some unseen force, the York ships began to respond. A strange distortion pulsed through space. Gravity itself seemed to warp and twist, pulling the ships closer to the York's grasp. A chilling realization hit Captain Graves. The York were not just erasing ships, they were warping reality to make them disappear. They were rewriting the laws of the universe. "Stay in formation," Graves barked. "Don't let them pull us in." But even with the quantum shields active, the pull of the Orcs' gravity warping technology was overwhelming. One of the smaller ships in the Coalition fleet was yanked toward the enemy like a moth to a flame. The crew watched in horror as the ship's systems flickered, its structure beginning to distort and break apart under the immense gravitational force. "Shut it down. Get it out of there," Reyes screamed, but it was too late. In a flash, the ship disappeared, wiped from existence, as if it had never been there at all. The void left behind was haunting, an empty space where once there had been life, now gone, erased from memory. The silence fell once again. It was louder this time. The message was clear. The York were here to finish what they had started, and humanity was running out of time. Graves clenched his fists. "We fight on. For every life lost, we fight on." As the York fleet advanced, their presence as terrifying as the silence they carried. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance. The loss of the ship sent shockwaves through the fleet, a stark reminder of the enemy they faced. The silence that followed was suffocating, and even the hum of their quantum shields seemed like a distant whisper in comparison to the overwhelming void of space. Captain Graves stood frozen on the bridge of the Aegis, watching the screen as the remaining ships adjusted their positions, the desperate sound of crew members scrambling to follow orders. "Focus," Graves shouted, his voice cutting through the tense atmosphere. "We can't afford to let fear take hold. Keep those shields up and stay in formation." The fleet held steady, but the impact of the York's gravity warping technology had shaken them all to the core. The ship that had been lost, a symbol of their hope, was gone, erased from existence as if it had never been. It was a powerful reminder that even with their advanced technology, even with their combined strength, they were no match for the York's silent assault. The York fleet advanced slowly, almost deliberately, as if savoring the fear they instilled. Their ships radiated an unsettling, unnatural darkness, warping the space around them. For every moment the Aegis and its fleet hesitated, the enemy drew closer, pulling them into their sphere of influence. "Captain, we're being drawn in," Lieutenant Reyes reported urgently. "The gravitational field is intensifying. We need to move faster." Graves gritted his teeth. The York were clever, patient. Their weapon wasn't just about destruction, it was about dominance. They didn't rush to kill. They simply wore their enemies down, one moment at a time, until there was nothing left but silence. All ships, increase speed, break through their perimeter. Graves barked, his voice firm and commanding. "We need to get to that planet. It's our only chance." The fleet surged forward, their engines straining against the growing pull of the York's gravity. The quantum shields hummed louder as they pushed against the warping forces, their effectiveness the only thing keeping the ships from being swallowed into nothingness. Graves knew that this was the turning point. If they didn't reach the planet in time, they would all be consumed, just like the first fleet that had vanished without a trace. But the York weren't going to let them escape so easily. From the front lines, a new wave of energy pulses erupted. It was unlike anything the fleet had encountered before, waves of distortion that bent space itself, rippling outward in an expanding sphere. The pulses hit the shields, sending violent tremors through the ships. Some of the smaller vessels in the fleet groaned under the pressure, their shields flickering dangerously. "Brace for impact," Graves shouted, gripping the edge of his command chair. The Aegis shuddered violently as the energy waves collided with their shield. But it held. For now. "Incoming," Reyes cried, pointing to a new anomaly on the scanner. A York ship, enormous and almost ghostly, had detached from the main fleet. It was unlike anything they'd seen before. It didn't just look like a ship. It looked like an entity, an organic extension of the silence itself. "This is it," Graves muttered, his heart pounding. The York had taken the fight to a new level. They weren't just attacking with weapons. They were attacking with their very presence, forcing them into a corner where escape was impossible. The Aegis bucked again, and this time, a tear in the shield formed, exposing the ship to the oncoming distortion waves. The crew braced themselves for what was to come. But just as all seemed lost, a surge of energy shot from the planet ahead. A burst of white light, brilliant and powerful, engulfed the fleet, cutting through the Orcs' distortions like a knife through water. "What in the stars is that?" Lieutenant Reyes gasped. The energy came from the planet, an alien device, ancient and powerful, lying dormant until now. As the energy pulsed outward, it pushed back the Orcs' gravity warping force, forcing the Orc ships to slow their advance. "Now's our chance," Graves shouted. "Get to the planet. All ships, move." The fleet surged forward once more, propelled by the sudden surge of energy. The York fleet, momentarily thrown off balance by the interference, scrambled to regain control, but it was too late. The Coalition's ships broke through the final wave of gravity distortion and entered the atmosphere of the planet. But as they landed, Captain Graves knew the battle was far from over. The York had a grip on the galaxy that could not be easily shaken, and though they had found a temporary reprieve, the real fight, the fight for the very soul of the galaxy, was just beginning. The fleet landed on the planet, their ships coming to rest with a heavy thud. The sudden cessation of motion felt almost surreal. After weeks of uncertainty, of being hunted and pushed to the brink, they had reached their destination. But Captain Graves couldn't shake the feeling that this was merely another beginning, not an end. The planet before them seemed ancient, its surface pockmarked with craters and ravines, its atmosphere thick with an unnatural fog. The energy they had felt earlier, the pulse that had repelled the York, was emanating from deep within the planet's core. "Prepare the teams," Graves ordered, his voice steady despite the unease settling over him. "We don't know what we're dealing with here, but it's our only lead." Lieutenant Reyes nodded and turned to issue orders. The Coalition's soldiers, scientists, and engineers began preparing to deploy to the planet's surface. It was a rush, an overwhelming sense of urgency pushing everyone forward, but Graves couldn't ignore the nagging thought in the back of his mind. The York were not far behind. As the teams descended, the planet's surface unfolded like a forgotten labyrinth. Towering alien structures, half buried beneath the dust of eons, loomed over them. The air was thick with a strange energy, a hum that vibrated in the bones of every person who stepped foot on the ground. The pulse of power was stronger here, closer to the heart of the planet, and it called to them like a siren's song. They followed the signal deep into the planet's heart, weaving through narrow corridors and vast underground chambers, each more complex and mysterious than the last. The closer they got, the more palpable the tension became. The York were closing in, Graves could feel it. Their ships were circling above, waiting for any sign of weakness, any crack in their defenses. "We're almost there," Dr. Ilara Voss said, her voice tight with anticipation. "This is it. This is where the signal is strongest." They reached a vast cavern, its ceiling lost in shadow. At its center, a massive structure pulsed with energy. It wasn't just a machine. It was a relic, ancient and alive, a thing of such advanced design that even the brightest minds among them could hardly comprehend it. "What is it?" Graves asked, his gaze fixed on the structure. "It's not just a weapon," Voss replied, her eyes wide with awe. "It's a beacon, a signal to the York. They'd been using it to amplify their power, to spread the silence." A wave of realization washed over Graves. The York hadn't just been attacking, they had been spreading their influence, trying to engulf the galaxy in their silence. This beacon, this device, was the key to their strength. "Can we destroy it?" Reyes asked, her voice low. "I don't know," Voss said, "but we have to try." The team began setting up the equipment, the tension thickening with every passing second. They had no idea how much time they had before the Urk found them. Every moment spent in the cavern felt like a countdown to their doom. Then, as they worked, a new alarm blared through their communication systems. Graves' heart stopped as the signal came through. "They found us," Reyes said, her voice laced with dread. "The York are descending." Graves cursed under his breath. There was no more time. The beacon, this ancient structure, had to be destroyed now, before the York could harness its power. "Activate the charges," Graves ordered, his voice sharp. "We'll make our stand here." As the team worked quickly to deploy the explosives, the distant hum of York ships filled the air, growing louder with each passing moment. The air itself seemed to warp as the York began to land, their terrifying silence creeping closer, suffocating every inch of the planet. The ground trembled as the charges activated, and a bright light filled the cavern. For a moment, it felt like the universe itself was holding its breath. And then, with a deafening roar, the ancient structure exploded, sending shockwaves through the planet's core. The beacon was gone, silenced forever. The York's grip on the galaxy began to falter, their connection to the silence severed. But as the light from the explosion faded, Captain Graves knew this victory was not without its cost. The York would not let go so easily. Their war for the galaxy was far from over. But now, for the first time in a long while, the silence was broken.